Well, good evening, and thanks so much for joining us for tonight's conversation with NPR's David Folkenflik. I'm Mitch Teich. I'm the station manager at North Country Public Radio, and I'm just really delighted that so many people have signed up to be part of tonight's event. We are in webinar mode, so I can't actually see you, but I hope you're someplace comfortable and settled in for what I think will be a really thought-provoking discussion about the media. Before we get started, I have just a couple of quick housekeeping messages rather. First, and most importantly, I am sure you are aware that NCPR is an audience-supported service. Everything that we do, from the local reporting we do to the national shows we air to our website, app, and our transmitters are made possible with your financial support. We are going into the last week of our fiscal year, and we would love to end it in a very strong position. If you haven't contributed yet this year, or you would consider an extra gift, please visit ncpr.org/give, and thank you so much. Secondly, I want to take a quick moment to thank our sponsor for this evening's event. The Adirondack Foundation has played a pivotal role in supporting many of our initiatives over the years. As community members, we are pleased to share many of the priorities that they do. While they work in program areas such as early childhood development, economic vitality, and civic engagement, we cover all of these topics in the course of reporting on the things that are important in our region. Thank you so much to the Adirondack Foundation for sponsoring our conversation tonight. Finally, we have already received many great questions from people in the audience this evening, but it is not too late to add yours to the mix. Please use the Q&A button someplace down there on your screen, and the very talented Jessica Lawrence will pass those questions along to me. All right, well, I think we're out of time at this point. No, not really, but I want to get to our guest tonight as quickly as I can so that we can get to asking him some questions. David Folkenflik started his professional career in print journalism in Durham, North Carolina at the Herald Sun, working for over a decade at the Baltimore Sun, and then made the jump to NPR, where he has covered the media and its intersection with our broader society since 2004. And in the last 18 years, he's won the National Press Club Award for press criticism 5 times, written a book about the Rupert Murdoch media empire, and been called a really weak-kneed, backstabbing, sweaty-palmed reporter by none other than Geraldo Rivera. We are thrilled to have him join us for the next hour. David Folkenflik, welcome to the virtual North Country.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me on in this digital way. I've been, as they say, IRL in real life up there. Beautiful country, and wonderful to engage with you in this way.
And in fact, you were born in upstate New York, not too far from where we reach, a little bit out of our area.
A little bit west, a little bit perhaps out of your broadcast reach, but a native of Rochester, although I moved away at a young age and then went back to school up in Ithaca. So some real time spent up there and some real valued years.
Fantastic. Let me ask you this. What was this beat like when you came to NPR 18 years ago? I mean, do you remember the burning questions that your work tried to answer in those days?
Sure. You're setting me back a moment. It's been a minute, right? When I joined in late 2004, it was just after the presidential elections. There were questions about the credibility of the national press, particularly in its ability to cover conservative Republicans running for office, the president's reelection campaign, George W. Bush. There were questions about the adequacy of the press in covering first the invasion of Iraq and then the nature of the occupation, the risks to American, what we were there for, the mission, and increasing skepticism about what we had been told and fed by official sources. So there was this question of trust. There was a question of, I remember when I was there, the Boston Globe, I believe, and the New York Times each announced plans to lay off or downsize by 5% of its newsroom. And this was considered something worthy of a spot, a minute-long thing at the top of the hour, and perhaps a conversation on one of the big shows. Within 3 years, in 2007, on a single day, the New York Star-Ledger, which had been one of the dozen largest metro newspapers in the country, laid off or bought out 44% of its staff. So you got to see this incredible acceleration of the economic unraveling of these newspapers that had powered the American news system and ecosystem for all these years. And that was a huge issue on the plate. There was, of course, the question of cable news, MSNBC and Fox really starting to pose a financial and prestige and just place of mind threat to CNN, which had for so many years been the only player in truly general cable news. And you were seeing digital innovations online. There were things like web journals, sometimes called web blogs or blogs. This was always painstakingly described to you and explained, like, a little bit like saying Mozart, comma, an 18th century composer, but this was what innovation was made of. And there was sort of the earliest forays into podcasting would happen within a year or two. So this was kind of the moment at which I joined. There was an acceleration of digital innovation. There was a collapsing in some ways of newspaper finances and effort, an early effort by the Times to put its opinion section behind a paywall really failed. And at that point, people thought that paywalls would not be a viable way to sustain newspapers. We now know that they're probably, in many cases, unsustainable without them. A different, in some ways, more innocent age, even as we were in the middle of two wars, one of which seemed to be problematic by the time I joined in November 2004, one of which seemed more noble in terms of Afghanistan. And later on, of course, that would unravel too. But, you just come out of this shocking incident in which Dan Rather, for years the chief anchor for CBS Evening News, a top figure on 60 Minutes 2, then 60 Minutes, had done a piece on President George W. Bush's war record that, while it may have been true in its rough outlines, was not based on real documentation and was, I think, rationalized by some pretty shoddy journalism. And, that was a huge hit. And this is the kind of system we've lived in ever since.
It is interesting to think that it was not so long ago that words like blog and podcast came with quotation marks around them.
Right. I mean, we didn't have social media. Social media would be something like the gossip pages of the New York Post, right? It's just a different time and a different era. And it was one where the gatekeepers of major main news organizations like ABC and NPR and Washington Post and others could tell that there was going to be the dawning of a new era. But truly the extent to which that was going to be realized, I think, was not fully anticipated and certainly not yet being experienced back then.
The follow-up question actually comes from a member of our audience tonight who wanted to know when you think things started to change and media outlets more noticeably began leaning towards the left or the right, or were there rumblings of that already circa 2004, 2005?
So let me answer that question in reverse. Let me take the first part, or the second part first. If you think about the Bush years, Bush won re-election clearly over John Kerry. Kerry wasn't blown out, but he lost Ohio and he lost. And that's offered a kind of certitude that W didn't have after the 2000 election, God knows. And he was, in a sense, riding high. He felt validation and the vindication of what he'd been doing and how he had been doing it. Within 2 years, that was changed. By, I want to say, January of 2006, reports came out in the New York Times that had been held up for about 15 months, showing this vast warrantless wiretapping being conducted by the NSA of American citizens in ways that seemed to not only be without warrant, but without legal basis, that is, violated federal law and promises that Americans would not be spied on American soil. And part of it was involved the vast sweeping changes in technology that enabled this to be done so easily. And the New York Times had held it back. And then you started to see a series of reports that really chipped away at the seeming, what shall I say, the imperviousness of the Bush administration to criticism or attack. And in 2006, the year of horrors, things really eroding in terms of American standing in Iraq. You saw, of course, the Hurricane Katrina and not only the man-made disaster that represented in retrospect, but also the disastrous response to it by the federal government and its abdication of sort of a strong, forceful action saying, we can help, we are here, we are part, no matter who you are, we are here for you. There was a punchier nature to the journalism, a refusal to accept what was being told. I remember Robert Siegel interviewing Michael Chertoff, then the Homeland Security Secretary, and being castigated by Chertoff for, talking about incidents that had occurred in downtown New Orleans. And Siegel had stopped him cold. He said, Chertoff said something effective. This is why we don't pass around anecdotes in times like this. It's too important to be careless. And Siegel, at that time, one of the senior host on All Things Considered in terms of tenure, simply said, this isn't being passed around as anecdotes. This is being relayed by experienced war and disaster correspondents for NPR who witnessed these events themselves. And he wasn't willing to simply defer to authority. I'm not saying Siegel would have done that, a notoriously tough-minded journalist, but there was a fraying of patience and deference, I think, that manifested in a variety of different ways. And in addition, the confluence of cable news, ultimately financially profiting off an opinion structure on Fox, and MSNBC only truly finding its footing in an anti-Iraq war liberals crouch after years of kind of fummering this way and that, combined with what the online world developed, which was that you really, there were few places that could prove indispensable or addictive that didn't have some sort of lean or some sort of voice or edge. The Huffington Post, Breitbart, and Drudge, all these places, it made for the emergence of voice, and that's so close and adjacent to opinion that it was almost inevitable. It's like a cheap shortcut. If you say my side's right and your side stinks, it's a cheap shortcut. And let me add one other observation, which is that you really would start to see the consolidation of American newspapers into a somewhat nonpartisan or trying to be neutral stance after World War II. People coming home, you have mass, even greater explosion of literacy. You got the GI Bill, but also you have a bunch of newspaper consolidations in major cities that might have had 4 or 9 or 13 newspapers. Suddenly you had 3 or 2 or 1. And if you've ever been, back when I lived in Ithaca, there was Tops and Wegman was not the fancy place it is now. And the professor I took microeconomics from my sophomore year said, look, you're going to have Tops and Wegman. Why are they next door to each other in adjacent huge lots? And the reason is, if you have one of the grocery stores all the way on the east side of town, the other grocery store is going to be just west of that, because it's going to want everybody else that it can in the city to say, well, it's the most convenient thing is to stop at this store. And then they kind of do this thing effectively. And then they're basically smack in the middle of the median spot of where the population base is for that area. And that's what newspapers did. And then when you have one newspaper, they don't want to offend anybody. It's why the Associated Press is known for being down the middle. They were selling to newspapers owned by Republican proprietors and Democratic proprietors, Lutherans and Presbyterians, whoever were operating these things in the late 1800s and 1900s. They wanted to appeal to all of them. And that's the same way that newspapers were. It's the way in which USA Today was born. Offend nobody. And it turns out that that period of the post-World War II era to, say, 5-10 years ago, or the last couple of years, that was the anomaly. So people are saying, why are we having this thing now where we're doing this crazy thing where we have ideologies? Well, there's a reason. There's the Democrat and Chronicle in Rochester and the Waterbury Republican in Connecticut. And it's because these places were frequently identified with political parties or religious sects or other passions. And now until the most recent times, that has been the anomaly when people strove to kind of rid themselves of such affiliations and affinities. And I'm not sure that's for the better, but that's what you're seeing, because people are no longer saying we're only competing with newspapers. They're saying we're competing with anything about which people are passionate, willing to devote their time and get information from, even if it's not always news.
It is interesting to think about. There was a really long period in the American press in which cities had 5 and 6 and 7 and 9 and 13 newspapers, and each of them appealed to their, to a particular readership.
Yeah, I was looking at this at one point. I gave a talk in Cleveland, and I'd done a story that I'd been interested in doing, a story that I later followed up on. And I looked at all the names of the places that had preceded the Plain Dealer. And it turned out there were places affiliated with parties, with religious movements. One was a labor movement, one was abolitionist, one was for business interests. It was almost like cable channels, sliced in very fine ways and very specific interests. And that's the way to think about it in some ways. And that's why those places had a more defined voice. You knew what you were turning to. And it's why, if you talk to people, and they think back to their parents or grandparents, often folks coming off, the manufacturing line, even if they had done the overnight, would read 2 or 3 newspapers. Because they knew they had somehow absorbed the idea that they needed that to get a fuller understanding of what was happening, that one place wasn't going to serve them in all the ways they wanted.
How many newspapers do you read in a given day?
Well, I don't receive newspapers in hard copy at home anymore. My mother, who lives with us, does receive the New York Times every day. We live just outside New York City. My wife was like, look, we got plenty of publications. You don't need to do that. But, do I subscribe to the LA Times, which I consider my hometown paper, as I grew up fundamentally in Southern California? I do. Online, I get the Times and the Post and the Wall Street Journal and the other Times. And I read a lot else besides. I read British papers. I read, the New Yorker. I used to love California Standard. There's a lot of good publications out there. I read a lot of, having worked for the Baltimore Sun, I read the Chicago Tribune, the Baltimore Sun a fair amount, just to see what's going on. And because I know people there, and I read a lot of websites that didn't used to exist, so I end up absorbing a fair amount, both through reading publications like the New Yorker or the New York Review of Books or the London Review of Books or things like that, and the LA Review of Books. But because that's a way that you can kind of sample books without actually reading all of them, because you just can't get to all of them, right? But I must confess that Twitter, in many ways, is my cheat sheet, where it's a time suck and it's a diversion and it's an easy way to get into food fights. And at the same time, by following journalists, by following scholars, by following human rights activists and lawyers and business leaders and politicians and scientific figures, I get a lot of information. I get there faster than I would if I simply waited for a reporter to write about it. So I often know about things before they are reported about widely, because I've tried to sample folks from a lot of different parts of the world and a lot of different sectors. And that's an accretion over the, 12 years or so I've been on Twitter, 14 years I've been on Twitter. But the idea is to give yourself a sampling that people are going to direct you to the stories you need to read. And it may mean that, for example, I never read Reuters as a source. I don't go to Reuters.com, but they've got a lot of terrific reporters, and people may flag it who cover a certain sector of legal stuff or who are scholars in a certain area.
I want to ask you a little bit about storytelling before we get to some of the, I think, 7,000 questions that people have asked. And in general, what do you see as the key to telling the stories that you do to a general audience, so it is not just a reporter talking to other reporters about reporting?
Such a fair question. Mine is a meta beat, right? It's me reporting. I'm a journalist reporting on journalism. And sometimes that can be pretty, people are like, isn't that just navel gazing? The way I approach it is this. I used to cover politics. Before that, I covered higher ed. I've written about other things here and there. The media writ large is an incredibly influential, at times powerful institution through which Americans typically gain their understanding of the broader world and the immediate communities around them. So we've got to hold those institutions accountable just like we hold government agencies accountable, just like we hold major businesses accountable, or labor unions or religious institutions. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of celebrity. Sometimes we're just breaking it down and explaining how it works. Sometimes we're telling fascinating stories from the inside, or telling you about somebody you think you know, but there might be more detail that's more interesting. But rather than being apologetic about intruding and say, oh, I'm so sorry, but there's this thing about journalism that just bear with me a moment. I'll tell you. It's like, look, there are these powerful folks out there. They're desperate for your eyeballs, which they sell to other people, to advertisers or to cable companies. Some of them have ideologies or corporate interests, and they're going to manipulate you. It's a wild time out there. I'm going to try to, call balls and strikes. I'm going to try and tell you what's important as best I can. And these institutions need to be held accountable. Sometimes I own, and that's okay. And I'm not apologetic about it. Now, the way I do it, I want to do it with voices that are compelling and interesting. I want to tell stories that you can't hear the same story everywhere else. I want there to be a value to turning to NPR or going to npr.org or streaming our apps or whatever, so that you're finding something you're not just finding somewhere else. If I am doing the same story as someone else, I want to be bringing something a little different, whether it's because I'm authoritative because I've covered this beat for 22 years, or whether it's because I've got somebody, you had Chris Stirewalt, the former director of political editor for Fox News, testify on the Hill 10 days ago. And so everybody in America who wanted to could see what he had to testify. He didn't talk about the pressures within Fox. He talked about the pressures on Fox. Well, 45 minutes after his testimony, he sat down with me and he talked to me for an hour. And we did a story that we then turned around and put on All Things Considered and posted on the website the next morning. And you would have turned to it just within a few hours and heard a story of his interview with us in a way that he didn't talk to anyone else. He talked to, I think, his own employer, which is called Newsnight, News Nation, I should say, owned by Nextel, owned by Nexstar Public, or a huge conglomeration of local TV stations. But, I did that because he wasn't going to a million places. If he had agreed to do it, but he was going to talk to 6-10 other places, I'm a one-guy shop. I'm going to go do something else. So there's that. You want to do it with authoritative voices. You want to do it with compelling stories, compelling voices, stories you're not hearing somewhere else. You want to do it with humor. I think that's an important part, and humanity. We just told the story of the parents of Seth Rich, who was a 27-year-old staffer at the Democratic National Committee, who was killed in 2016, whose death became a punching bag and just sort of a vehicle through which people tried to discredit Hillary Clinton, the Democrats, even accusing them of perhaps involvement in her murder, claiming he was involved in leaking thousands of emails from Democrats, which he was not. And it became part of conspiracy theory, hyped by Fox News and hyped by President Trump, for that matter. It's a complicated story. We can talk a bit about it more, and there's some implications for how body politics works. But to me, sitting down with these parents, the first time they've done an interview in 4.5 years since they filed a lawsuit against Fox, and letting them talk about what it meant for them on a human level to be involved as part of conspiracy theory, not merely the airing of their grievances, but talking about why conspiracy theories are not just sport for people on 4chan or Reddit, why this is something that infects our supposedly credible press, like the news side of Fox News, as well as the opinion side of Fox News, how it can, the op-ed pages of the Washington Times, how it can infect lawmakers and public discourse. This is not happening to abstract figures. These are happening to a couple in Omaha who, other than their son's aspirations, had no connection to the political arena. And to have some humanity, that mattered. And, I think that we've always got to remember the key thing, and I know you guys think about this there as well, Mitch. I've talked with Brian Mann a lot about these things, right? Is the question of making the stakes clear. Why does this matter to the people that you're talking about? And why does this matter to the audience you're talking to and sharing the story with? Their time is precious. Their attention is often hard to get. When we're doing it, our radio pieces, whether or not you're streaming them on radio, you might be in the car, you might be washing dishes, you might be folding laundry with the kids running in and out. These are all things that I do. I know everybody else does too. And so we have to earn your time. Don Hewitt, who created 60 Minutes, said to me, I always want you to be able to, or he said, I always want you to feel compelled to listen to us, even if your back turned to the television. And what he's talking about is the immersion and connection and transportive nature actually of radio.
The original driveway moment.
Yeah. That's right.
I think one of the things that seems significant, especially about the story about about Seth Rich's parents, is you kind of tell the story about what the Riches now see as naivete about their trust that people would do right by them, and yet you were able to earn their trust in telling their story today. How much of the story of the media in 2022 is about trust in institutions?
Oh, I think that trust is unchanged as perhaps the most enduring component of what we do. Fox used to broadcast itself as the most powerful name in news, or often the most popular name in news. That's not what I think of as most important for a news organization. It may be desirable. It may be what you want, particularly if you're an ideological owner or proprietor. But to me, I want, this isn't the part we always say out loud, but I want to equip people to be able to make the choices for themselves and to participate in public life as citizens and not just as consumers. And when it came to the Riches, the idea was to earn their trust by being patient and fair and to listen to them. Not to accept everything they say is true without double checking, but to treat them honorably, honestly, and squarely. There are times I do really tough pieces on folks, and I will often say ahead of time, you may not love this piece, but I got to ask you some questions, and I got to make sure you're aware of the questions I'm going to raise. And it's very hard afterward to raise complaints. And when they do, I say, I laid this all out for you, and you come back again later and you do it again. And sometimes those are the people who have the most respect for you because they know that you did it right. You took your time. And I can't say, we're all mortal. We all are fallible. We all make mistakes. But we try to hold ourselves pretty accountable. And I expect that of others, particularly in my profession, which is supposedly based on accountability and transparency and sharing, their homework in public, showing how you reach the conclusions you reach, right? The Rich family also, I broke the story behind how a story appeared on Fox News, both on its website and later on its airwaves, that claimed to have real sources within law enforcement saying their son had leaked emails and claiming that there'd been proof that there were links between him and WikiLeaks, neither of which held up. We don't know that there was ever a source that talked to this reporter. If there was, who that was. And Fox claims not to know, or has claimed at least in the past not to know. And Fox never kept faith with the public or the family to explain what went wrong. But I broke the story of how this broke wrong in significant part based on a lawsuit that I got access to that laid out in documentary evidence what happened. And then I went further and went to people in the lawsuit and talked to them and got them to explain things to me. And I kept on the story. And I ultimately was sued by the person who had orchestrated this story behind the scenes, this story that did not have a firm factual basis or even a factual basis seemingly at all. And so this family, I think, trusted that I had gone through, in a sense, a parallel version of what they had gone through, that this guy had attacked them. He attacked us. We settled, but we didn't settle in a way that involved, how do I say it? We didn't settle in a way that involved us stepping away from a syllable of what we wrote. We stand by everything. We didn't retract anything. We're not paying this guy a cent. And in fact, what he acknowledged was that he would not have to pay certain legal damages or costs that we bore for proving that he had his legal team had made false representations to a judge. So it's that kind of settlement. It's really, he withdrew his case with our agreeing not to go after him for certain legal costs, as I understand it from the outside, from the documents that were filed.
I want to get to some of the questions that people have submitted in advance, and also remind people who are watching us right now that you can submit questions for David Folkenflik over the next half hour using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. And I think we might have hinted at this before. Several people who sent in questions ahead of time wanted to get your take on an issue that is local in nature, but I think is representative of maybe a larger phenomenon. The Congresswoman who represents much of the North Country picks and chooses to which media she grants interviews and informs about ostensibly public events, and has notably and publicly cut out the very public radio station you're talking with this evening. What is at stake from a climate where elected officials choose not to speak to constituents who listen to or read a particular source of news?
I mean, it's very poor form. And I say this not simply as an adherent of public radio, but just as a longtime political reporter. When you pick and choose not only to whom you give interviews, but to whom you inform about public events, you are essentially cutting off swaths of the public and your own constituents from knowledge of what you're doing. And a public servant thinking as a public servant doesn't do this. The public servant thinking as a politician might. Congresswoman Stefanik, who I'm assuming you're speaking about tonight, has really migrated from somebody who came off as kind of a young Mitt Romney type Republican, at least as an observer from afar, to somebody who's kind of Trump light, and who's using the press as a foil. And the problem for the press when you're used as a foil is you still have to do your job, and you don't want to take the bait in a way that makes it seem like you're the opposition, because you're not. You're holding her accountable. You're highlighting her record. You're presenting it to the public. You're testing her statements and her commitments and her campaign rhetoric against what she actually does. That's not an oppositional force. That is a part of the checks and balances that make our system work when it does work. And when we don't have that, the system doesn't work. So the real question is, in a sense, she's, the old expression was cutting off your nose to spite your face. She is trying to show that if you subject her to coverage she doesn't like, or if somehow she can identify you with a sector she doesn't like, that somehow she can either score points with her base or shut off certain kinds of critical questioning from other news outlets that might not want to forfeit access to her. When that's happened to me, what I've done is redoubled my reporting, because, Fox News has done that for years to me. Sometimes they'll let me in, sometimes they won't. I went for years when I first started at the Baltimore Sun, where the New York Times would barely return my calls. When I ended up moving to New York for NPR, suddenly when I was 8-minute walk away, and their people would just stream to various parks and places to meet me for sandwiches and tell me what was going on inside, suddenly the world opened up. Now, it may have just been new leadership in their PR department, but suddenly I could talk to editors and do other things. But, I was talking to people all along. The question is whether I was given access through official channels as well. So in her case, it's like, if I'm the editor at, a newspaper in her congressional district, I'm saying, well, let's make sure we talk to every person who works for her, who will talk to us, whether on or off the books, and every former person who worked for her, volunteered for her, and learn the good, the bad, the ugly, and the indifferent, everything about her, pro and con, lobbyists who have dealt with her, companies that have asked her for favors, universities that have sought grants under programs that she's championed. Let's find out what she's done for this district. And also let's find out the degree to which she's acted in its interests or against its interests, and figure out how we define that. Let's set our own agenda, because if she's not going to talk to us, that doesn't mean we're going to forfeit covering her. And oftentimes some aggressive coverage will yield a certain degree of grudging access, because they'd rather own some of the real estate of the time you devote to the issues involving her. But, I think it's important for the press not to be high and mighty and impressed with itself, but also not to back down, and not to think that this is anything but obviously the business you're in. And I'm sure, your staff gets that. And I'm sure that that a lot of political figures get that. If you looked in the Albany area, the local press there was pretty tough on Governor Cuomo, who'd been in office for an awful long time, taken a lot of people for granted, and done a lot of things that were pretty questionable and dark indeed. And it seems to me that the Times Union and other local publications tried to step up and really do some aggressive reporting. They weren't going to leave this to the New York Times, and rightly so.
Another question writer asks, do you think the danger against U.S. journalists has abated somewhat since the last presidency, or is it still high? And this person writes that they're not interested just in reporters at, say, Trump-related events, but also during protests at which journalists seem to be targeted by police, even though they're displaying their identifying badges.
It's such a good question. That very question inspired a project that I did over the winter with my colleague, Mark Rivers, who works on Morning Edition. It seemed to me that in talking with journalists, I did some stories on this, but not a ton. After the social justice movement really erupted with the killing of George Floyd in late May of 2020, that journalists were targeted. This is what I was hearing. And peers at places like the Committee to Protect Journalists and the U.S. Press Tracker and others outfits were finding much the same. And there were a lot of factors. I mean, with a lot of those protests, there was real chaos and confusion. And although it was a very small minority, it still, given the number of protests that went on, there were significant numbers of riots and some looting and some fires and other things, and things that were scary. In places like Portland, they were recurring. And, in places like Minneapolis, there were times of intense pressures and eruptions of outrage. But police seemed to be targeting reporters. And it seemed from the reporter's standpoint that a lot of what was happening was that police were realizing that their words were no longer being taken as authoritative. Police said, meaning that was fact in a story, as opposed to police said, meaning this is what some interested parties who were witnesses and possible actors in this episode were saying. That distinction, police said, is that declarative, carved in marble? Is that a version of accounts? Well, if you're thinking about Uvalde and what happened down in Texas, more and more we're learning that was just a narrative, a tale being spun. And as it turned out, whether or not intentionally, just a tissue of lies or statements that just couldn't bear up to scrutiny and haven't, and reflecting horribly on law enforcement down there. But what we saw during the social justice movement was that, people with iPhones were disproving the claims of police time and again. And reporters knew this was the case. You had seen this with Walter Scott in North Charleston, South Carolina. You had seen this with people who had been dragged from their cars and either dashboard cameras or significant others' iPhones or body cameras or whatever were disproving what police were saying time and again about threats to their lives and why they reacted in the way they did. But what was amazing to journalists was that it's one thing to find this from another person. It's another thing when it's happening to you. I talked to journalists who were tear gassed when it was clear they were only with other journalists and not posing any threat. And some of them had gone to the place where they had been told to go by police, only then to be shot with tear gas canisters at them in their legs, in their torsos. I talked to people who were clubbed and beaten and arrested and detained. It was mayhem. I talked to a colleague at KPCC in Southern California who was covering an event in Long Beach in the middle of the day, so it wasn't nighttime. He had a press badge, he had recording equipment and a pad out, and he was shot by a rubber bullet that hit him in the throat. And I think it knocked his crowns out of his tooth. This is a problem. To be fair, the mayor of Long Beach did apologize, but this was happening all over. And so I went out early this year to Los Angeles, where on a single night a year ago, in March 2021, something like 40% of the arrests and detentions of American journalists that had happened the previous year occurred. And so there was a night where there was a clash in covering the sweeping of this popular local park of 200 homeless people, 180 homeless people. And there were just mass arrests of protesters, but also mass arrests of journalists whom they knew to be journalists. And the question is, why are you arresting and detaining journalists? 2 or 3 were actually taken downtown and booked. They were there. They had announced themselves as journalists. They're people who have bylines on a website that covers news, and a little bit with a point of view in response to the listener's earlier question. But I think that there was a radicalization of journalists towards police as a result of firsthand experiences during protests where it was turned on them. Even in cities believed to be progressive, even in cities where police chiefs had developed a pretty good relationship with the media, it happened time and again. And I think from the police standpoint, they say, we just can't quite process how the same media who comes to us and says, can you get us behind police lines on a murder? Can you help me? My car is submerged. Can you help my TV van? Can you give me tips on what's happening here? Can you protect me from rioters? These are the same people who are saying we're misleading them or treating them badly or whatever. They're going to take some, rioters' word over us. Forget it. We're not going to really distinguish between them and protesters. And in real time, in the dark, oftentimes with people who don't have a lot of experience in frontline policing, because so many cops were called to push to the front lines during this time of tumult, this is what happens. And I have some sympathy from their standpoint as well, having talked to a number of folks in law enforcement. But it's an acute question. I really feel good about the 2-part project we did back in late March of this year on that very subject about the LAPD, because I think it's a key question.
We have a question from an audience member who actually teaches journalism and wants to know how you feel about using the word lie in reporting, specifically referencing the big lie. And this person says, I know that's what it is, but it still jars me every time I hear a legitimate source use the word.
The big lie is about the election of 2020, and it's the way in which people have characterized Trump's, what shall we say, fraudulent claims of fraud. The big lie is a phrase that Chris Licht, the new head of CNN, has basically asked his anchors and journalists to stay away from, because it fits very neatly with Democratic rhetoric on the subject. But he didn't say they couldn't use the word lie. I think the word lie has to be used relatively sparingly, and I think it has to be earned. But I would not tell people to shy away. To be honest, I believe I was one of the earliest, I may have been the first journalist at NPR to use it during the Trump administration. It was a day in July of 2017 where, I think it was 2017, if I got it right, where Kirstjen Nielsen, the Homeland Security Secretary who succeeded John Kelly, who went on to become the chief of staff, there's a lot of rotating jobs there, was there denying that there was any policy to separate children from their parents at the border. And the problem with that denial was that her predecessor, Kelly, had said in an interview with our colleague John Burnett that this was something they were actively considering, and that it would be an effective way to discourage families from coming across the border. And that the Attorney General at the time, Jeff Sessions, went on Fox and basically called it their policy that day. But she went out there, she was asked to go out there in part because the press secretary didn't want to have to do it. The president didn't want to have to do it. And so she had to take her lumps. And she talked about how it was offensive to even suggest it was a policy. Well, again, the man who was chief of staff at the time she was having that had said they were actively considering it as a policy. He had said much the same to Jake Tapper earlier. And people down there were documenting it as actual policy. So she was insulting the intelligence. If you say something false under questioning, that you have evidence that have been shown evidence to be wrong, and you persist in saying it, it goes a long way to suggest that your state of mind is such that you have reason to believe that it is untrue, and you can call it a lie. I just think it has to be reserved for cases in which such things are clear cut. I tried to make a case in the piece that I wrote that was somewhat controversial inside NPR. It was held for a day and we really wrestled it out. And then they said, okay, you can go with it. And then they were thankful they did, but they were very anxious about it. Not anxious is the wrong word, apprehensive, because it is a big word, because the professor is correct that it's not, once broached, it becomes awfully easy to use it lightly. and you want to get away from that. And then people will think, well, we've used it for this situation, we got to use it for that situation, or we use it for that politician, we got to use it for their opponent. And suddenly it's just all over the place. And then if everything is a lie, nothing's a lie. And there has to be room for hyperbole. There has to be room for stretching. There has to be room for trying things on. There has to be room for extemporaneous speech in political life. Not everything is perfectly framed by lawyers ahead of time, and that's okay. Because you want there to be running room for free and robust debate. But we have, God knows, had free and robust ongoing debate in this country for the last, 250 years, and also particularly for the last, call it 7. And I think it's okay to call something what it is. I just think you have to show your evidence and make clear why. You cannot assume that people trust you to make that judgment if you don't show.
We have a question about Rupert Murdoch in light of the fact that you've written about the
I'm
Murdoch.
familiar with the man.
The question is, do you think Rupert Murdoch's chosen son to take over his position after he dies will be able to bring some balance back to their news empire? Or I will add this, or is that something that the Murdoch empire even cares about in terms of its future?
Can we just take a moment? And whatever we may think about Rupert Murdoch, pro or con, whatever we may think about the state of matrimony, pro or con, news arrived to us today, thanks to the New York Times, saying that this gentleman, following the experience of his 91st spring, has decided to get a divorce with his much younger and 4th matrimonial companion. Jerry Hall, the former wife of the model, actress, and former wife of Mick Jagger, to have such a sense of one's own imperviousness to mortality that one thinks there is someone else out there for you at the age of 91. I say, salute to you, sir. A sunny future is admirable.
Ensuring that there is another chapter to be written.
Always. I've written what we call our lifetime tribute to him several times over. It's a thing you do and you don't talk about that much at NPR, much like at the Times and other places. You have to prepare these things, but man, I've had to tear it up so many times. So Murdoch has basically, anointed his elder son, Lachlan, the person he had initially wanted at the head of his empire 2 decades ago, and then had splits with, and then brought him back in when he was under scandal, and then elevated him up above his brother, who in some ways showed more executive skills, James. Lachlan is pretty resolutely conservative. Lachlan stood by Tucker Carlson, despite Carlson's embrace of some crazy, wild, and I think quite damaging conspiracy theories about, what he calls the Patriot Purge, the January 6th insurrection. He thinks it's not an insurrection. He thinks it was a protest that got out of hand, and that these people were innocent of anything, but also that they were just expressing their rights, and also that what they were being told they shouldn't protest about was valid. I mean, he's on both sides of what really happened there, but either way, whatever happened, the people who were supporters of Trump there were there for the right reasons, he feels. And he's he's put out there a bunch of things that have been discredited, but discredited even before he presented them publicly. And Lachlan has been fine with that. Lachlan is atop this sort of dual empire of television and print that includes the Times of London, the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, the Sun tabloid, one of the more popular newspapers in London, the dominant newspapers throughout Australia, Sky News in Australia. So he's got all these outlets that he could fashion. And while in Australia, for example, they did seem to embrace certain pro-climate science stances in a way that they've rejected and ridiculed in the past. They flirted with that a few times previously as well. And the real question to me is how long that endures, or whether the bloom comes off that rose. What you typically see Rupert do and what Lachlan has tended to try to emulate is to blend sort of an aspirational conservatism, kind of a hardline ideology, often rough on immigrants, pro-business, anti-tax, anti-regulation, with a certain degree of flexibility to try to get various political parties on side with you. You know, in some ways, they've been more effective in Britain and in Australia by occasionally endorsing the left of center party. You know, so if you get a centrist left candidate against an extremely right candidate, occasionally they'll go for the centrist left candidate, Tony Blair in Australia, in Britain, Kevin Rudd in Australia. They won't go for the more liberal figures, but they'll do that as a way of keeping both parties on the hook for, hey, these guys may support me, so I better take good care of them in terms of regulatory decisions and policies towards broadcast and publishing and antitrust and all these things, taxation, all these things these guys care about. In the US, they've really, on the national level, gone almost entirely on the right. And Lachlan is, if anything, I think more resolutely conservative than his father. So, you know, you could be conservative and want the news side to be straight down the middle. I think what you've seen at Fox is reporters actually, a number of them try to hold the line on the election coverage, on what's happening in Ukraine and Russia, on other key things. But their control of the mind space of Fox and the real estate of Fox and the hours of the day on Fox, or the evening hours in particular, you know, is withering. And a lot of their number have been marched out of the newsroom, and people who want to flourish and prosper know what they're doing. You know, you used to hear people like Bill Hemmer be a lot more down the middle, but as he's prospered, you hear him sort of having a lot of questions that sound a lot like Republican National Committee talking points. John Roberts was on CNN, CBS. He's now one of the Fox hosts. You know, when he was a White House reporter for Fox, you'd hear him one way when he was doing Shep Smith's 3 p.m. news show, and a very different way if he popped up at 9 p.m. on Sean Hannity's opinion show. And Roberts, I think, still tries to be an honest broker, but, you know, it's an honest broker being pulled increasingly to his right. And that's just the nature of what Fox does. CNN has its own issues. Clarice Licht, you're seeing right now, trying to drain the place perhaps of some of its more individualized voicing, the idea that this is personally about you, the Trump years, or politics are about what you think. And he's trying to drain that a bit. But, you know, for Fox, this is what it is and what it has been and how it's made its billions. And it makes billions of dollars a year. So, you know, Lachlan's like, why do I want to mess with that? Why do I want to mess that up?
We have a question about criticism from folks like Noam Chomsky and Chris Hedges that NPR is part of the quote corporate media, and why aren't true left-wing political dissidents along the lines of Chomsky and Hedges not heard more frequently on NPR? Not that you are the guest booker for NPR.
Yeah, I mean, one of the lucky things is that I cover the media for NPR, and they pay my bills. So I believe in NPR, but you know, I have it written in my contract that I have full liberty from NPR. So I don't speak for the network, and it doesn't tell me what to cover or how to cover it, which is great. It's great liberty. And it means at times when the network gets in the unwelcome glare of the news, I can cover it freely. And let me say this, it lives its values, because when times get really ugly, when we had a sexual harassment scandal involving a top news executive, when there are questions raised about our reporting and it's worth my looking at, I have free reign to do whatever reporting takes me to. You know, people may look for Chris Hedges or Noam Chomsky and use that as a barometer to determine are there alternate voices. And they're both very smart people, but there are a lot of other people out there too. You know, and I would argue if you go and look through our site and search, you will find, you know, take a week or a month's reporting, and you will find voices that span the political, geographic, demographic, age, ethnic, whatever spectrum you want to identify. We'll have it there. We'll have it across the country. We'll have it across the globe. We'll have new young leaders, voices of dissent, on the right and the left, in their own voices, talking at some length, whether on sort of the talk shows that are our member stations have dotted around the country, or through the news programming and podcasts that we offer at a national level. I think it's very hard to argue that our voices are monochromatic, whether by the profile of who they are or how they think. And I think in some ways that podcasting has only more greatly diversified that. If you think about podcasts like Throughline, or Rough Translation, or Code Switch, or any of dozen others, you're hearing voices that you might not have a decade ago. And they may not be name brand for folks who came of age in the 70s and 80s, but they sure are often rising and influential voices that should be heard, and not simply on the left, but not excluding the left, very much including that, because that is part of the America that we try to reflect. I think one of the great things about NPR, one of the things that I think we've given a lesson to other major news organizations on, is the need to allow people to be reflected in their own voices and to recognize themselves in their coverage. And you don't always get that in 6 to 12-second sound bites on network news, or even on cable news, which sometimes doesn't stop long enough to listen to what people are actually saying. But I think you will hear that on what we have to offer. I really do. So I don't sense that people are like, oh, well, that's Noam Chomsky, so we can't hear it. I think it's a question of what are we talking about? Who will add to this conversation? And voices of dissent or of critique of mainstream institutions come in all kinds of packaging.
Well, we have just a moment left, and I want to make sure I get to this incredibly important question that was asked, and that is, what is your personal stand on the Oxford comma?
I am more indulgent of the Oxford comma than you might think, and then probably I've got the Chicago Manual up here somewhere. It probably is against it, if I remember correctly, but I think it can keep you out of some wrongful implications. Certainly, I never use it on the air. That's a doctrinaire position.
Yeah. Well, before we wrap up, I want to again thank the Adirondack Foundation for supporting tonight's event. Thank the NCPR staff, and let me try that again. I want to thank the NCPR staff, especially Jessica Lawrence, Bill Hanel, Bonnie North, and others for all the legwork in bringing tonight's event together. Thanks to all of NCPR supporters for making this evening and everything else we do possible. Again, I hope you'll make your fiscal year-end gift today at ncpr.org/give. And thank you so much to NPR's David Folkenflik for making time to join us this evening. If you haven't seen enough of me this evening, don't forget to join us tomorrow evening at 7 at Township 7 Brewing in Dickinson Center for the Howl Story Slam. It'll be a great time, as the Howl always is, but this was a great time too. David Folkenflik, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks, Mitch. Great pleasure. Wonderful to join you all, and thanks to those who made it possible.
Hope we'll see you in person one of these days.
Love that.
Thanks to everyone again for joining us, and have a great night.